This is Dennis Ramundi. I'm here with my co-host, Phil Goldberg, author of American Veda, our podcast, Spirit Matters Talk, spiritmatterstalk.com. Our guest today on the show is Joseph Prabhu. He is a professor of philosophy and religion at California State University, Los Angeles, and is also an occasional visiting professor at the University of Chicago. He has been a senior fellow of the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard University. And Joseph, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to come on our program today.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I look forward to a lively conversation.
Joseph, it's Phil. Let's fill our listeners in a little bit about who you are and your background. You've had a distinguished academic career. They could tell by your name and whatever accent remains that you're from India, and they would probably assume you're Hindu, but you're not. Maybe you can tell us something about your background and what brought you to the study of philosophy of religion.
Well, believe it or not, I was in a previous incarnation, and as you mentioned, my supposedly Hindu background, you probably know that Hindus have many incarnations.
Yes.
So in one of them, the most recent one, I was an economist. In fact, I was taught at the Delhi School of Economics by the Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen in the 60s, and had done sort of 6 years of economics before I got a scholarship to Germany. And one of the people besides Amartya Sen who was influential in sort of turning me towards philosophy was Ramchandra Gandhi, the grandson of Mahatma Gandhi. And I then started my studies of philosophy and religion in Germany, went on to England, and then finally came here to Boston for my PhD. So that's by way of saying that while I no longer work professionally in economics, though I am occasionally invited to give lectures by rather careless people who don't know, and I did that recently in Argentina. But I maintain a sort of serious interest in the philosophy of economics. And in my work, which is both interdisciplinary and intercultural, because as I move between the United States, Europe, and India on a fairly regular basis. So that intercultural aspect is reflected also in my academic work, right, and in my sort of professional work generally.
Joseph, I wanted to ask you, you are a professor of philosophy and religion. Do you make a distinction between religion and spirituality?
Yes, I do. But all right, let me say that, and then also, as we're mentioning spirituality, and I've looked at some of the other distinguished guests whom you've had on your show, and while I haven't listened to all of them, I've listened to a couple. So on the first point, Dennis, yes, spirituality I see as, if you want, a more experiential matter, whereas religion, incorporates much more than experience. There's doctrine, there's ritual, there's obviously the institutional and material side of religion. And in that sense, I would say that would be one distinction. But the other related point, which has to do with the very title of your show, Spirit Matters, is that I think that matter matters also. And in that sense, don't make, while of course there's a distinction between spirit and matter, I don't make a dichotomy between them. They're not, spirituality is for me not a sort of separate sphere. It's conceptually distinct, but it's not a separate sphere, in that I tend to see spirituality as really the sort of depth dimension of material life. And therefore, like a, I guess, renegade economist, do take economic and social and political life very seriously. And that's also reflected in my work.
Joseph, maybe you can make a distinction for people between the philosophy of religion, or how philosophers look at religion, and what the mandate of a philosopher of religion is, as opposed to other disciplines such as religious studies, or the sociology of religion, or the psychology of religion, or theology, just to give non-academic listeners a sense of what it means to be a philosopher of religion.
Yes, well, that's a very good question, because the philosophy of religion looks at religion from a sort of primarily conceptual standpoint, and deals with, so for example, if just to mention a couple of sort of typical problems, what is the nature of God and or an ultimate reality like the Tao or Brahman or Ishvara, or so it's looking at the sort of conceptual differences between these realities. I mean, so a clear difference is that the Tao is not personal, whereas the notion of God, at least in most usages, is personal. And similarly, Brahman is also impersonal, and has a certain relationship with the world, which is more inclusive than at least the traditional notion of God, which sees the world as something that is created by God, and where God, at least in most traditional usages, as a reality, is thought to exist separate from the world. So those differences, of course, do matter, because to take one example from mysticism, if one were to say that mysticism aims for a union with God, then if one argues philosophically that God is ontologically transcendent to humans, where God is infinite and we humans are finite, then that makes a union with God in any straightforward sense problematic. Because how can a finite thing really unite in any real or robust sense with something that is infinite? And so Christian spirituality, for example, that maintains this distinction of God's sort of separateness, says, no, it's not a union, it's perhaps at most a communion with God. And a sort of strict union is sort of ruled out. Now, that would not be the case necessarily in other kinds of mysticism, where, let's say, in the notion of Brahman, where that kind of separateness between God or the ultimate reality and the world is not maintained. It is possible and it is coherent to talk about a union with Brahman. So, that goes some way towards explaining the differences between different kinds of mysticism.
Right.
To mention,
Joseph, you from 2005 to 2011, you served on the board of trustees and the executive committee of the Council of a Parliament of World Religions. They had a big meeting this year. I know Phil was there. What drew you to that? How did you get involved with that being on the board? You are obviously very involved with it. And what does that Parliament hope to accomplish, or what would you like to see that Parliament accomplish?
Okay, well, that's one part of my work, which is on interfaith relations, and we can certainly talk about that. I would like, at some stage, if it's of interest to you, to sort of come back to my role as a philosopher and also as a culture critic.
Right.
So,
well, you can take those in any sequence you like. If you'd like to go back to that and then come to the Parliament of World Religions after you discuss the philosophical points, that's fine too. So, however you want to take it.
Yeah. Okay. Then, as we are really talking about, the question of what a philosopher does and how that's distinctive from being a theologian or a scholar of religious studies, that's the sort of concern. But when I sort of, the book that I'm working on now, which is on someone who was important to me and continues to be important, Raimundo Panikkar, is sort of son of a Hindu father, hence the name Panikkar, and a Catholic mother, Spanish Catholic mother, who has been influential in my life. He died in 2010, but he was influential in at least two ways, and as it turns out, it'll also overlap with interreligious matters and the Parliament. But I'll come to that in a little while. But Panikkar was someone who did two or three important things. One is that he was a pioneer in interreligious dialogue, done in a serious manner. In other words, he lived his Hindu-Christian existence to the very end. And as I was telling Phil informally, his last will and testament specified that part of his ashes were to be buried in a Catholic cemetery in his native Spain, and the other part were to be buried in Benares, or to be immersed in the Ganges in Benares, behind a house that he maintained there for many years. So one of the things that Panikkar did, and which I'm very sympathetic to, is taking, first of all, religious life very seriously. And in Panikkar's case, it meant, that it wasn't just doctrines and beliefs. He actually shared the life of Hindu and Buddhist communities, and tried to establish what and how interreligious dialogue should proceed in both a respectful but also a critical fashion. And that doesn't always happen because in general, either people are deeply sort of suspicious of each other, or if they do, on the more liberal side, try to engage in dialogue, then they usually sort of try to play nice and be polite. But Panikkar honored the differences between religions, and he thought that those differences had a lot to teach us, and that the dialogue should be a robust dialogue about those differences and also about the commonalities. That was one thing that he did. The second thing that he did was to establish something that has now become more common, both in religious and in theological circles, which was to look at this phenomenon called multi-religious belonging. In his case, as I said, that was sort of biographically determined because Hindu and Christian life was part of his upbringing. But the kind of theology that he developed was very interesting, because the Christian theology that he developed certainly had very strong Hindu and Buddhist influences. And he wrote, he wrote more than 70 books in 6 languages, and wrote on scholarly books on Hinduism and Buddhism. And in fact, one of the books, which is a 900-page translation and commentary on the Vedas, called the Vedic Experience, is used in classrooms around the world. It's a very authoritative text. So he developed a Hindu Catholic theology, which is the result of many, many years of immersion in both Hinduism and in Christianity. And as I say, that has quite a lot of interest, both because it's something new, and also I think sort of points the way to the future. I mean, as you both know, our future is increasingly an interreligious future. My own daughter is married to a Jew, and I developed interesting liturgies for maintaining both the Christian and Jewish side of their children's life and their life. And likewise, I have a number of students who occasionally ask me to sort of marry them, and they are interreligious folks. So this sort of problematic, which operates at many different levels, is something that Panikkar sort of pioneered. And
I'm glad you brought up Panikkar. And before you continue, Joseph, let me let the listeners know, in case they have never heard his name, that he's a very important figure, and his name is spelled Panikkar. So they can Google him. I had the pleasure of hearing him speak once, and it was a very profound experience. But do continue. I know you wanted specifically to talk about this phenomenon of multiple religious belonging that he represents.
yes, because it is something new, and again, I think there are interesting cultural differences. I mean, here in the West, the boundaries and the demarcations between religion operate in somewhat a different way from how they operate in India. Here, if someone says that she is a Christian, it means, and she probably might even define herself as saying, well, to say that I'm Christian is to say that I'm not Hindu, I'm not Jewish, I'm not Buddhist, etc. Whereas, and it has to do with our cultural and intellectual history. I mean, it goes all the way back to Aristotle, and Aristotle's idea of identity, that to say that something is something is to say that it's not something else. Whereas in India, the notion of identity is quite different. In India, the notion of identity is not marked in terms of difference. It's marked really in terms of assimilation. So, to take an example, the poet Kabir, who was in a sense both Hindu and Muslim, had little difficulty in saying that he was both. And I could give you many other examples.
Now, Joseph, could I interrupt you for a second? I want to ask about that. So I'm very curious.
Sure.
If he said he's both Hindu and Muslim, or if someone said they were Hindu and Christian, I assume that from the Hindu perspective, from the institution, from the actual religious leaders of Hinduism, that might be okay. But from Islam, from Christianity, that is not acceptable. Or does it not matter what the institutions think if the person, him or herself, consider themselves both?
Well, that's a very good question, because, I mean, obviously, the way Hinduism is structured, there is no pope or authoritative figure that determines what one's belonging is, but in both Christianity and Islam, of course, that's not the case. There's sort of more institutional authority. So yes, that is a legitimate question. In the case of Panikkar, he was fortunate that his bishop in Benares was an extremely forward-looking and liberal person, and thought that this multiple identity was important for a number of reasons. Sadly, Christianity, even though it's existed in India from at least, we have written sources from the 3rd century, but there is a very strong oral tradition that Thomas the Apostle, one of Christ's 12 apostles, came to India in the late part of the 1st century, and there's a whole mount in Chennai.
Yes,
Madras,
I've been there.
Which is called Thomas Mount, and so there's a whole very, very strong tradition that Christianity came there at least, from the time of Thomas, and we have written sources from at least the early part of the 3rd century. But in spite of that, because of political and colonial history, Christianity is regarded as a Western religion, and that has had rather tragic might be a little strong, but still unfortunate consequences for Christians in India today, who are being, I'm sorry to say, harassed and in some cases persecuted. And some of that has to go back to this fact that Christianity is regarded as a sort of Western imposition. And Panikkar's bishop was mindful of that and thought that I think it would be good, not just for the sake of getting along in India, but also because of the fact that Christianity itself has had a very varied cultural history. It began as a Jewish faith, and then moved to Asia Minor and the Greek world, and then from there to the Roman world. So one of the things that Panikkar sort of raised as an important question is that if Christianity could be translated from its Jewish roots into Greek categories and then into sort of Roman law, why, if there is very strong indications that even if Christ did not go to India, which he probably didn't.
The people in India will tell you exactly where he was.
Yes, exactly. In Kashmir, I've seen the grave and so on. Yes. So, but in any case, the sort of philosophical and cultural challenge, which is in fact Panikkar's first well-known book, The Unknown Christ of Hinduism. The Unknown Christ of Hinduism. And by the way, Panikkar was quick to add that Christ was unknown to Christians as well. So, because Christ seen as a mystical symbol is, in Panikkar's formulation, goes well beyond historical and institutional Christianity.
Right.
And so Christians know the denominational Christians and the institutional Christianity knows the Christ phenomenon in one particular way, but so do Hindus and so do others as well.
Joseph, what is your, if I could ask, religious identity, if any?
Well, no, I mean, I'm not shy about saying that. I like Panikkar, but in a slightly different way. I regard myself as a Buddhist Christian. I mean, the Buddhist influence has been very strong in my life, but it's Indian Buddhism more than obviously Eastern Buddhism. And I've certainly been a scholar and a practitioner of both traditions. So in my own case, I've followed in Panikkar's footsteps, but as I said, it's been more the Buddhist rather than the Hindu side. But again, for people who know about Indian Buddhism, it grows out of Hinduism, and
I'm curious, and this is maybe a digression, but there are many examples, less well-known and illustrious than Panikkar, of people who have a sort of dual identity as Christians and as Hindus. One of them was Bede Griffiths, and I'm curious whether he and Panikkar knew each other.
Oh, yes, no, they're very close friends. And they came to India at roughly the same time. And I've written about Bede quite a lot, whom I knew personally, and whose ashram I spent time in. And yes, they were allies. I mean, the difference, which is certainly worth commenting on, is that Bede was more of a poet, and his particular mysticism was a sort of poetic mysticism, the marriage of East and West, and psychological, whereas Panikkar was very much the philosopher and
scholar.
Scholar. And so, but their meetings were, which I, personally sat in on, at least on some of them.
What a privilege.
Yes, no, it was a great privilege, and it was also tremendous fun to see, their different but complementary approaches to this sort of what Bede called the sort of marriage of East and West, and what Panikkar called Hindu-Christian existence.
Right, Joseph, I wanted to ask. You consider yourself a Buddhist Christian, other. Panikkar, a Hindu Christian. What is the value of having a religious identity? What if? Why isn't it just as worthwhile for somebody to say, "All right, I'm going to take the spiritual teachings or techniques of this religion, and if I want to go to a Hindu ceremony, I'll enjoy doing that. If I want to do a Buddhist ceremony, I'll do that." I'm speaking about myself now. Sort of, I grew up in one particular. Of one particular religious identity, but I don't see myself, and it's everybody's own choice, a particular a specific value in adhering to one group. Is that just a personal choice?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I would say, and Panikkar and I, both agree on this, that this matter of multiple religious belonging is, in both our cases, I mean, in Panikkar's case, biographically because of his parentage, but in my case, because I sort of grew up in India among Hindus and Buddhists, that I absorbed through school and through my sort of cultural influences so much of that sort of cultural world that I mean, from an early age, to give you an example, from the age of 8, I think, I would see the Christian Mass celebrated Hindu style, and that left a very strong impression on me. So I certainly, Dennis, think that it's important to go deep into a tradition, and if that tradition fulfills a person, then there's no reason to sort of mix identities. In my own case, I found that, and continue to find, that Buddhism strengthens my Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
My colleague, Paul Nitter, who used to teach at Union Theological Seminary in New York, wrote a title that I think I could certainly endorse. Without the Buddha, I could not be a Christian. And I would say that is roughly true in my own life.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think I perhaps that may be going a little too strong. I could certainly be a Christian, but what I would say in a slight variation on Paul Nitter's title is that certainly being Buddhist has sort of strengthened my Christianity in my own self-perception. I'll give you an example. One of the sort of key Christian concepts is the concept, which in fact is biblical, of self-emptying. Kenosis is the Greek word for it.
Mm-hmm.
And the Buddhists provide the most rigorous methodology and practice of self-emptying. The shunyata, emptiness, and the practice of shunyata is a very concrete and rigorous way of sort of self-emptying, so that it's not just left at a abstract doctrinal level, but actually practiced.
Yes.
So,
go ahead.
No, so in that sense, to answer Dennis's point, yes, by all means. I mean, lots of people like Thomas Keating and others who,
Yes.
Certainly regard themselves as Christian and would not, in spite of the fact that Keating has clearly learnt from Buddhism, would not call themselves Buddhist Christian.
Right.
And I honestly respect that, obviously. But in my own case, as I say, there's been so much sort of Buddhist influence as a result of my upbringing that it just seemed natural.
Yeah, and you're not alone in that. I've heard that many times from certain Christians, especially the ones who are mystically oriented. I want to shift gears, if I may, to get back to your point that matter matters. You are not an ivory tower philosopher. Well, I'm sure you spend plenty of time in the metaphorical ivory tower, but you are also very active and engaged socially and in terms of issues of the real world, so to speak, in a religious context. You're extremely active in the interfaith world, as Dennis mentioned earlier. You were very active in the Parliament World Religions. How do you see this intersection of philosophy, in your case, and social activism, or are they just separate parts of your life? And why do you think it's important?
Because the world is first of all, we live in this world, and many religions teach us that compassion is one of the key religious virtues. I mean, it's love God and love your neighbor is, in a sense, both the cardinal teachings of Judaism and Christianity, and many other religions as well, even if they don't use the word God. So that the love of the world, the love of neighbor, is a key sort of religious precept. And when I say that matter matters, I am not, let me put it this way. I mean, Christianity or Buddhist Christianity for me is a this worldly affair. The other world is not, at least for me, obviously like a philosopher and like a religious practitioner, I speculate about it, but my waking hours are really spent not sort of speculating about this, but really trying to practice compassion in a concrete way. And so that also ties in with my earlier work and continuing work as an economist. I think I probably, Philip and Dennis, might be the only or at least certainly one of the few guests on your show who would regard Karl Marx as a spiritual influence.
Explain that.
Because, sorry?
No, I said, explain that. I'm curious.
Well, because Marx was someone who, in a secular way, was very concerned with what was happening to Europe after the Industrial Revolution, and with the tremendous disruption, both political and economic. And Marx's this is a long topic which we may not have time to go into, but I've certainly written about it. And so, by the way, because that's the tradition that I sort of broadly see myself in. It comes out of Latin America, but is now sort of spread to other parts of the world. The tradition called liberation theology, and it's the tradition that says no, one should shift the emphasis of religious life into, first of all, a this worldly emphasis, and secondly, making sure that the social life and economic life are conducted on ethical lines.
Right. The current Pope of the Roman Catholic Church, I mean, this is his particular angle on Christianity, on theology, is it not?
That's absolutely right. I mean, he comes out of this tradition. I mean, in Argentina, they call it theology of the people, but broadly speaking, it's from this sort of liberation perspective. And there's an interesting story. One of the great sort of figures of liberation theology was the late Brazilian Archbishop Dom Helder Câmara, who was a very compassionate man. And Câmara remarked with some irony, he says, it's very strange. When people see me helping the poor, they call me a saint. But when they hear me asking, which I often do, why are they poor, then they suddenly call me a communist.
Well put.
And to me, the question, what structures in society and what conditions in society produce the poor is a very vital question. I mean, that's the difference between charity and justice. Charity tends to the poor, but justice really concerns itself with what is producing poor people in the first place.
Joseph, as a philosopher and observer of world conditions, as someone who cares a great deal, I wonder what your assessment of this issue is. There's a lot of what we think of as religious violence and religious conflict in the world. And to some people, religion and religious differences and religious ideology is the cause of that conflict. Other people would look at it and say, well, in most cases, religion is an excuse for conflicts that arise out of things like, Marxists would say, access to resources and social justice issues and power issues and that sort of thing. How do you see that interplay of social forces and religion and the uses to which religion is put?
Well, thank you. That's a brilliant question, and one that I have to speak about again. There is, Phil, as you know, here in Los Angeles, a group that sort of doesn't focus exclusively on that question, but nonetheless deals with these issues of how one relates religion to social life. And in general, I would be somewhere in the middle, in that I certainly see that because the stakes are so high in religion, that religion by its very nature tends to be conflictual. So I don't shy away from that, and I think it's important that we not do that, because there's just sort of too much going on around us, not just, in the obvious examples that are coming from Paris and San Bernardino, but all over the world. I mean, it's religious strife is, or at least what may be broadly called religious strife. But of course, your question is a very important one to investigate, and there's no one sort of blanket answer, because I mean, obviously, conditions of conflict differ from place to place, from situation to situation. But there's no question in my mind that religion, easily allows itself. In some cases, it's the prime motivator. In other cases, it's sort of drawn into conflict that has its sources elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's important for religious practitioners not to sort of take the easy way out and say, our scriptures, all preach compassion and peace and that stuff. Because there's just, if you don't take that seriously, then if you want the other side has a very easy opening. I mean, I'm talking, about people like Hitchens and Dawkins and, people who quite easily point to the fact that, of course, religion is in many cases involved. So I think it is a very serious question that, as I say, I think the more thoughtful religious people like the late René Girard of Stanford, who had, a very profound book on religion and violence, which has had tremendous influence, and others like him have sort of taken that question very seriously.
Right. Joseph, I wanted to thank you for taking the time to come on. We're sort of out of time, but this would be a good starting point for our next interview with you, because there are many, many more areas that we can go into with you, and your knowledge is so in-depth in so many areas that one interview just barely scratches the surface. So, but thank you so very much for your time today, and hopefully you can make some time sometime in the near future where we can go into more depth.
Oh, without question. I'll be happy to, and I want to end by sort of congratulating both of you for this venture. As I said, I've looked at some of the people whom you've sort of interviewed, and the very idea of getting people to talk honestly and searchingly about religion and spirituality, I think, is a great service to society.
Thank you very much.
Joseph. We appreciate that very much. And thanks for taking the time to be with us. And I'll see you around Los Angeles soon.
Okay.
And I hope to see you next time I'm out there.
I hope so, Dennis. Yes, I very much look forward. So let me know. I mean, Phil has my email, and certainly Phil also has my telephone. So whenever you are coming to LA, let's make it a priority.
Absolutely. We'll plan on it. You're listening to Spirit Matters, spiritmatterstalk.com. My name is Dennis Ramundi. My co-host, Phil Goldberg, author of American Veda, and our guest today, Joseph Prabhu. Joseph, thank you so much again for taking the time to come on.
Okay, thanks again. Bye-bye.
Bye.